Welcome to Bader International's Classic Online Motorcycle Sales. We're going to go ahead and do Chapter 5 of the teardown of this 1957 Harley Davidson Sportster. In the previous chapters, we, as you can see, started with a complete bike and went through and tore it all the way down, pulled the engine out in the last chapter. So today we're going to go ahead and pull the rear shocks, rear wheel, swing arm, pull the front forks off, and all the rest of the peripherals, as you can see. We have about 2 months to get this bike ready to go. I'm going to try to get her ready for the Las Vegas auction 2020. But if not, you'll see it up on my website. So we'll go ahead and get the first off the rear struts off and put a block under the frame and go ahead and get the back wheel off and the rear swing arm as well. So stand by and we'll go ahead and get that done. The first steps to pull the back wheel off, of course, is to loosen the nut on the rear axle. And since we have everything else off of the back wheel, the chain and so on, it'll just slide out very easily. The axle will come off to the left. The spacer will basically drop. I did put a jack underneath the frame to give myself a little bit of clearance on the wheel so it'll slide out without things going awry. And then I'm also going to go ahead and pull the rear fender struts off. And since we loosened them up on the last chapter, we just have to back the rest of this nut out, pull the bolts out, and these two struts will come right off. Then we're going to go ahead and pull the covers off of the shock absorber. It's just a little flathead screw right here. The caps pull off, and that'll expose the nut on the top. And then also we have the, as you can see, the old pinch nuts. That's what should be on here, so we'll go ahead and take that off as well. And then we'll go ahead and remove the rear swing arm. That's one screw here. Pull this clamp off, and then go ahead and bust the bolt loose, and I'll show you how to do that here in just a few minutes. Okay, so I bust the nut loose. Since I'm doing this one-handed, you'll have to bear with me. So you take the nut and the outer lock off, and then it usually just takes a little persuasion to get the axle to coming out. And there you have it. Drop the spacer. Then you have to walk the right side brake plate off of the actual stop there. So you have to just go to the left a little bit here. And there you have it. One back tire, one back wheel off of the bike. Let's talk about this axle for a moment. As you can see, we have a nut that has been chromed, and it's obviously not in good shape. You got a spacer that's chromed, as well as the axle. Now, would it be better to go ahead and get this stripped and then go ahead and have it reparkerized? You know, if you're a real purist and if you know that these are original parts, yes, but there's plenty of axles out there in the world that you can buy with spacers with the proper plating. I think Colony offers them. And again, they're just as good as originals, and you couldn't tell it once they're on the bike. Got a little spacer here that comes out of the frame section there. You see it has a couple of flats. And then also your chain adjusters held on with a couple of nuts. And you just slide it out. Same goes on the other side. See, again, doing this with one hand, it's a little bit difficult, but we'll get her. And again, this slides right out. Voila. Now that the back wheel is off, we're going to go ahead and take off the fender struts. And again, since we've already loosened these, I'm just going to go ahead and bust them loose here a little bit further so we can go ahead and take them off by hand. These are proper 1038 CP bolts, as you can see here, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe these bolts are supposed to be parkerized instead of CAD plated. So again, we'll double check our notes and go ahead and put the proper bolt back in its place. And let's go ahead and take this nut off here. This is the one on the end of your upper fork stud. And there you have it. Sometimes if they're in good enough shape, you can get away with not replating it, but this one here is marginal, so we'll go ahead and send them out for plating so we don't have to handle them with kid gloves. Speaking of gloves, the reason I wear these gloves is that years ago I went to my doctor and had a checkup, and he asked me if I drank, which I don't, and I told him no. He said, well, what have you been doing? I said, well, I work out in the shop and I have my hands in chemicals all the time. He said, well, go ahead and lay off the work or put some gloves on and come back and see me in a couple of weeks, do another blood test. So I did, and my blood came back perfect. So people can sit there and make fun of me wearing gloves, but the bottom line is if you don't wear gloves, a lot of this solvents and stuff will go right through your hands and right down into your liver. So I think I prefer to wear gloves and be called a sissy. So just a little bit of medical advice there. So we're going to go ahead and drop these back nuts here. And then the rear swing arm should be free and clear. So that's right, I also have to pull the top caps off of the shock absorbers. So stand by, we'll go ahead and get these off and I'll be right back. Now that I have the lower nut removed, we're going to go ahead and slide these off, and this should have been actually a Philister head screw if I'm not mistaken, but they've got a 5/16 headed bolt here. So once you get it loose, you just slide it down, pop your cap off, and you have another 9/16 nut exposed. And you take those units off. I already dropped this one here, as you can see. Bada bing, bada boom. And we'll go ahead and unscrew these nylocks. Oops, so I'll have to put a wrench on the back of that, so I'm going to have to use two hands. So I'll come right back after I have these bust loose. Okay, so we went ahead and removed the shock absorbers, and I went ahead and broke the nuts loose on the back of the actual shock studs to go ahead and get them removed. Sometimes they come off easy. Sometimes they take a little bit of persuasion. Let's see here. Yes, that one's a little stuck. So there she flies. But again, I'm working with one hand here. I would have held my hand over that so it wouldn't have flown out of my sight. But again, we'll go ahead and pick it up here in a minute. Also, we're going to go ahead and remove the rear swing arm now. We're going to bust this Philister head screw loose, and then go ahead and break the nut loose. You do have to put a wrench on the other side here, and if you look on the back side of your inner primary, you'll see that it has a slot, and that slot is to clear this little nut here, because again, your primary goes up right up against this here. But again, this is an amateur restoration. You can see that they've painted over all of these items, which should have been individually either cat or parkerized. And also, which is a big no-no, if you take a look here, they've got paint where your motor mounts are. Anytime you go to repaint your repaint your frame, make sure that you go ahead and you skin back all of the paint on your motor mount surfaces there, because again, that acts as a bit of a shim and will actually help to loosen the hardware up if you're putting a lot of miles on it. But again, scrape all the paint off of the ends of all of your hardware so you do not have that issue. So let's go ahead and get the swing arm taken off now. We just removed the rear shock absorbers, and it lets the rear swing arm drop, as you can see. And then I went ahead and took the nuts off the back of the actual shock studs. And sometimes these will come out by hand. Sometimes you need the persuader. But since I already busted these loose and they're just sitting there, I'm going to show you the easy way. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remove the swing arm axle. And also you have to remove this locking unit right here. That's a Philister head screw. And when you go to turn that axle, this is going to spin. So you have to put a wrench on this so it holds it so you can back off your threads. What's interesting is if you take a look on the inside of the motor, and I'm not even sure where I put that motor, but you'll see on the inside of the primary there's a slot in the back side of the actual primary, and that is to clear this little unit here, so because the engine's tight up against your swing arm. So let's go ahead and get the swing arm removed, and I'll show you all the hardware that it took once I do have it taken off. Just a little clue to take this rear swing arm axle out. If you look down here, you'll see that the threads of the actual axle are a larger diameter than the little flats for you to hold your wrench on. So you sort of have to grab it, just a little section of it, while you're ratcheting that off. So we'll go ahead and get that off now, and then we'll see if we can get the swing arm slid off. Once you've unscrewed the axle out of the actual nut over here, this is sort of riding free, and the axle itself has to be driven out of the shaft here because, again, it's sort of a tight fit in the bearings, and it just needs to be knocked out with a trusty hammer and a little punch here. So we'll get that knocked out. But again, that's something that you're going to have to deal with because you can only unscrew this so far, and again, it'll just continue to spin after that. As you can see, the rear swing arm axle is fairly well machined, and just so people know, I did use a brass punch and not the steel one, so just wanted to put that out there for the record. So now we bust this loose, back this nut off, which will actually give you some freedom to go ahead and get that slid off, because right now they're sort of adjusted for the actual tension against the frame section. So we'll get this off and get the swing arm off now. Okay, so I took my socket and I loosened this compression nut or pinch nut or tension nut, and the axle now will just slide away from the frame. And here's some of the inside shots of what you're looking at, that your bearings and your race retainers and so on. So we'll have to unscrew the covers on these, take the nuts off so we can pull it completely down so we can go out and have it sandblasted. So there you have it. One swing arm off. Now that we have the rear swing arm removed, we're going to go ahead and pull the front forks off. I have everything loose and removed from earlier, so we just need to pop that top off, slide the fork triple tree, lower triple tree out of the frame itself, and all the bearings will drop out of the cups, and then basically at that point we will have a completely stripped frame with all of the components off, and then we will send her off to the sandblaster or soda blaster, have it completely stripped. And little things like on this frame, as you can see, somebody obviously had a peanut tank on this, so they drilled the hole there, which that should not be, as well as this hole here, because the big tanks do not use that. It uses this one here and the one up front. Even though you can't see that when you have the big gas tank on it, it just shows the caliber of quality. If you leave something like that, and let's say down the road somebody goes to remove that gas tank and they see that you left the holes in there, it's just not going to bode well for the caliber of your restoration work. So just make sure you touch on all the bases, make sure you get all these little items taken care of. And again, items such as chromed cups, they all need to go away. It's not even worth having those stripped and replated. Just get yourself a new set. They're available, they're out there. So we'll go ahead and get the front end off now, and we'll see how she looks. I just popped the upper triple tree off with the handlebars, as you can see. And this is the upper bearing cup. And this is the sort of a dust cover. So you slide that off. And this little unit here has a couple of notches, and you unscrew that with a tool, or if you can do it by hand, like I am, you'll see it comes off. It's got quite a bit of threads here. And you have the upper race, so I just give that a little bit of a wiggle, and usually that pops the race out. Come on, there we go. And you'll notice the upper race has that taper here, and that is for this little unit here. As you can see, it sort of fits right in there. So if you ever go to put your races on, just make sure that you have that tapered one up at the top. So here we go, all of our ball bearings. So as soon as I pick this up, the front end's going to want to fall, all the bearings are going to come out. So it's going to take me 2 hands to handle this. So I'm going to put the camera down and go ahead and get that taken care of. Okay, so there you have it. The frame is basically stripped. We just need to knock these bearing cups out, take the bearings out, and here's the front end. And interestingly enough, this bike was a restored bike when I bought it, but needless to say, and I said this on one of the earlier chapters, this was a very, very amateur job performed to this bike. And items such as the incorrect fenders, the front wheels being laced improperly and so on, just made this a real shoddy job. But again, I knew the job was dangerous when I took it. I knew what I was getting into, but we will bring this girl back to as close to 100 pointer as possible. So let's go ahead and get the bearings knocked out, and I'll go ahead and take this front end apart. While removing this front end, you may have noticed that I put down a roll of paper towels here, and I did that to protect the rear portion of the front fender. And I just went ahead and put my little tin here because all my bearings are slowly rolling off and dropping onto the actual tin itself. Okay. And it's always good to use a magnet while pulling these out, because if you go to use your fingers, sometimes they'll drop down into the hole, and you know that hole does go through to the rest of your frame, so you may be fishing out bearings if you're not careful. So I go ahead and use the magnet, gets them out good and clean, and that way you don't have any issues. So next thing we'll do after we get these bearings out, we're going to go ahead and knock the races, or the bearing cups, I should call them. And that takes a hammer and a punch, and you just have to go at it from the inside and knock them out. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Well, there you have it. One naked frame. We went ahead and drove out the bearing cups. Used our trusty brass hammer and punch. So now we're going to go ahead and pull this front end down and get that taken care of. And after that, we're pretty much completely torn down, with the exception of the subcomponents like the brakes out of the drums, pulling the wheels down and so on. But those again will be in our next chapter. So let's get this front end down and we'll wrap up this chapter today. The next step in the process is to go ahead and pull this front end down. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and bust my axle nut loose, take it off completely. And I'll also go ahead and release the 7/16 nut here, and then I'll go ahead and pull my front brake cable and tube off of the front fork assembly. And while I'm at it, I'll go ahead and bust this nut loose here and then take my brake arm off as well. Then I'll come around on this side and I'll release this pinch nut and bolt here, and then go ahead and slide my axle out. And that'll basically release the front forks away from the front wheel. So let's go ahead and do that now. As you now see, I went ahead and pulled the axle nut off, pulled the brake arm off, the brake tube out, as you see over here. And I went ahead and loosened up all my front fender hardware as well while I had it here. And one of the interesting things I wanted to show you on this side here, this takes a special nut. I don't know if you could see the profile of this nut, but it has a little bit of a taper on the inside. And that's because you have a tapered area on your lower fork leg. So this goes through. So that was proper. 1038 CP bolt with that tapered nut, and that is correct for that. So now that we have all the hardware off, we're just going to go ahead and slide the axle out. And again, this is a two-handed job, so I may have to stop mid-term just to go ahead and grab the front end so it doesn't tear up the fender. So I'm just going to grab the end of that axle, give it a pull, and the front forks will then be liberated from the front wheel. One front fork set, one bare wheel. Here's the axle. Like I mentioned, I just pulled it out by hand. So now we're going to go ahead and remove all the rest of the hardware off of the front fender, and that will liberate it from the front forks. And then from there we'll go ahead and pull the remaining pinch bolt out and then drive the lower triple tree off with a little bit of a persuader. And it looks like I still have all of my fork tensioner items still mounted underneath there, so we'll go ahead and pull that off. And it takes a special bolt. You'll see it right over here. Let me see this one here, and it's a 7/16 head bolt, but it has a long shaft on the end, which basically sets this unit here in position and won't allow it to fall out. So we'll go ahead and get that done. And also you can see on the lower rubber boots here, this is a real tacky setup to where they went ahead and put zip ties on the lower fork boots. And needless to say, 1957, they did not have zip ties. So we'll go ahead and cut those loose and get this front end totally disassembled. And then we'll wrap up this chapter. Well, from when we first started this segment, I'd say the bike looks a little bit different. Now all we have is a bunch of parts laying around. Frame's already over in the corner, getting ready to be staged to go to the sandblaster. And we just have a bunch of parts spread all over the shop here. So let's just go ahead and recap. We went ahead and pulled the rear shocks off, the fender struts, all of the shock components, swing arm, front fork, bearing cups, front fender, front wheel, and the front forks. I just want to make it clear that I don't want to browbeat the gentleman that restored this bike before me. If this was his first restoration, he did a fine job. Or if he was on a budget and this was the best he could have done, this is a very nice bike. But again, we're going to sort of be taking this up a level or 3, let's say, to make it Concours quality, or concourse quality, depends on what part of the nation you're in. And every little item has to be absolutely perfect. Proper fit, proper finish, proper items like this front fender is incorrect. So again, we'll take this bike up to a very, very high quality, high standard restoration, but it does take a lot of time and it does take a lot of money to do it. So, and that's what makes these motorcycles so valuable when they're completed. So this is the end of this segment, and the next one we do will probably be doing a teardown on the front wheels or something along those lines. But I hope you've enjoyed these I don't know, 4, 5, or 6 segments we've done on the teardown of it. And we'll continue on with the rest of the work and as we move forward with restoring the bike. So there you have it. Again, this is Bader International. If you have any questions, feel free to give me a call direct, 805-798-1802. Or you can also drop me an email. It's baterintel@aol.com, BATORINTL@AOL.com. Thank you for watching.